My cat Freddie loves to be brushed and cuddled. But stirring up his cat allergens meant sneezing and itchy eyes. Then I found Purina One Live Clear. It's cat food that reduced the major allergen and my suffering in as little as 21 days. Now, we feel closer than ever. If you have issues with cat allergens, you really need to try Purina One Live Clear.
Try new Purina One Live Clear today. Purina One, a difference from day one.
How does PwC take your company to the leading edge? They bring the sharpest minds in tech to your team, so you can bring the ideas that will transform your business. They're passionate about your industry, so you can walk into any room with every advantage. And they're with you every step of the way, so you can know you're headed in the right direction. PwC builds for what's next, so you can get there now. Get started at pwc.com/us/leading edge.
Joining us on the guest line, Phil Tinline, who is an author. He is a documentarian, and we're discussing his latest work, Ghosts of Iron Mountain. Mr. Tinline, also the author of The Death of Consensus, which was chosen as the Time of London's political book of the year in the past. But Phil, thank you so much for joining us here on The Other Side of Midnight. Great to have you.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So not only as an author and a former employee of the BBC, and thank you for joining us, Phil, but you've presented a number of thought-provoking documentaries, and it's great to have you here on The Other Side of Midnight. Tell me about Iron Mountain, because this is a major, massive company with around $6 billion in annual revenue. I'm broadcasting right now from New York City, so actually a place that is physically a thing, originally a mushroom farm, if I'm not mistaken. So talk to me about this place in Kingston, New York, and how that all came to be.
Okay, so the first thing to say is that the corporation Iron Mountain has nothing to do with this story. The name comes from the same place, but they take the name after this whole story takes place, so just to make that clear from the get-go. But the place Iron Mountain, as you say, is originally it's actually originally an iron mine, and then it becomes a mushroom farm. And then after the Second World War, when there's a big craze for nuclear bunkers for reasons that we will remember, it becomes the guy who owns it turns it into a set of nuclear bunkers and document stores. And that is first made public, the fact that this extraordinary place with like great big world maps and luxury bunkers for executives from Standard Oil of New Jersey and, you know, chandeliers and places to watch cinema and have your family and so on. The fact that there's this extraordinary place under the countryside of the Hudson Valley becomes public in 1966. And that's, I think, clocked by a guy who is composing this hoax that the book is about, which is called Report from Iron Mountain. I think it's called Report from Iron Mountain because he sees this story in the Wall Street Journal in early 1966, because that's when they're coming up with the idea. But maybe I should tell you what the hoax is about.
Yeah, so get me into this report. I think it was basically a year after that expose, right? It was like 1967 when this report called From Iron Mountain, or the report from Iron Mountain. It was like supposedly this expose or reporter memo, maybe purportedly from elements that are connected to the U.S. government. But yeah, tell me about this report that connected itself to Iron Mountain.
Okay, so it's a complete hoax, and I'll just tell you how the hoax came about. So what's happening in early 1966, while these strange stories about bunkers are coming out in the press, something else is coming out in the press too, which is that obviously the Vietnam War has been getting going by early 66, but there's a moment when it looks like peace might break out. And you'd think that people would be pleased about that, but Wall Street actually dips. There's what's called a peace scare. Shares drop in value. And these three young satirists sitting in their little office on Fifth Avenue, just north of Greenwich Village, see this and think, hang on a minute, this is a bit weird. Shouldn't we, as I say, be pleased that peace is breaking out? So this gives them an idea. They think, because they're anti-Vietnam War, why don't we make up the story of a top secret government report that was commissioned by Robert McNamara in 1963 under Kennedy, which is supposedly aiming to scope out what would happen to America if permanent global peace broke out. And the joke is that it would destroy the economy, it would wreck society, and you'd have to do terrible things to replace the effects of war, like sophisticated forms of slavery for young men, make them play blood games, versions of eugenics, poison the rivers, invent alien scares, all kinds of outrageous stuff, right? And so they do this very seriously. There's a writer called Leonard Lewin who comes on board to do this, and he says, well, if we're going to do the story of a fake report, we have to write it, because the idea is it's been suppressed by the government because it's too outrageous. So he then spends, and this is why there's that time lag, he spends a year and a half actually writing this report. It's like 117 pages long. It's got 100 footnotes. Nearly all of them are real. He talks to really serious people like J.K. Galbraith and so on, or gets advice from them. And it's eventually published in November 1967 as the report from Iron Mountain into the possibility and desirability of peace. And they publish it as though it's non-fiction, and the publishers don't tell their sales staff that it's not real. So it's published as though it's a real report, and a big hullabaloo breaks out.
So what's the precipice of that report, or what's the ultimate finding in this, as you say, satirical report that's the report from Iron Mountain? Is it something that would have, in essence, explained why Wall Street and some of those interests, I'm going to put the word out there, the military-industrial complex, would want that war in Vietnam to continue at that time?
That's exactly right. The military-industrial complex is exactly the kind of idea that they are mocking. And that idea of the military-industrial complex, as you will know better than me, starts off not as a conspiracy theory. It starts off as a perfectly reasonable, critical set of remarks by President Eisenhower in his farewell address. It's beginning to become more conspiracist by this point in 1967. Jim Garrison, in the DA in New Orleans, has begun to seize on it. But that's not quite where these guys are. They're not conspiracists, they're satirists, which is a different thing. So what they're suggesting is that effectively that the report decides that war is the organizing principle of society. You can't have, the report argues, national sovereignty if you don't have the threat of an enemy. You can't have a government with serious power. You can't keep the population kind of conforming and under control if you don't have war, or at least the threat of war. And that's why they suggest, for example, the idea of poisoning the environment if nuclear war as a threat fades away, because then you've got another unifying threat that if the environment's destroyed, we must all unite against it, which gives the government more power. So it's deliberately pushing things to satirical extremes, but done in a way that's written very carefully. So it sounds, at times at least, when it's not saying completely crazy things, it sounds like a real think tank report from the mid-1960s, like somewhere from the Hudson Institute. Right,
yeah, like a white paper or something like that. So Phil Tinline, our guest here on the other side of midnight. I'm James Flippin. He's Phil Tinline, and The Ghosts of Iron Mountain is his book that's out now. That's what we're talking about, is this 1967 report, the report from Iron Mountain, which connects to a location not far from here that, in essence, was created to be able to store documents during like the atomic age. So, Phil, tell me, how was this report, the report from Iron Mountain? I have two questions that kind of, I think, connect into the same thing. How is it distributed? Like, how did people get their hands on it? Like, I can imagine in this day and age, it would be going viral on Twitter or TikTok or whatever. But, back then, how were people receiving it? And then also, what was the reaction to this report that I guess a lot of people, probably almost like a War of the Worlds, didn't know was fictional?
That's a really good comparison. And actually, the guy who wrote it, Leonard Lewin, was reading about the War of the Worlds flap while he was writing it. I've got his diaries, and you can see him sort of thinking about other hoaxes, and the guys who came up with the idea in the first place are thinking that way too. So the way it's distributed is very traditional. It's published as a book. And published by a reputable, respected publishing house called the Dial Press. But you have to remember, this is 1966, this is 1967, and this is a time when that kind of mid-60s playfulness, kind of everything being kind of a game, that you can do really kind of outrageous things, and the right people will get the joke, is very much still the spirit of the times. Now it comes out in November 1967. Obviously, not very long after that, you have the Tet Offensive, and then the assassinations of Martin Luther King, then Bobby Kennedy, etc. The violence in Chicago, and America is becoming more concerned about what's happening in Vietnam. It's becoming a different country. It'd be hard to do this report even a few months later. But this publisher publishes it, Dial Press publishes it as though it's real. And as I say, these are people who published Norman Mailer, they published James Baldwin. This is a serious New York publisher, but they feel able to do it in this way. And the editor on the report is a guy who later becomes famous as a novelist, E.L. Doctorow. And in the 70s, when he's a novelist, he is very much playing with that boundary between fact and fiction, including real characters in his fictional novels. And you can sort of see a beginnings of this as he's helping Leonard Lewin write this report in the 1960s. And then in terms of the reaction to it, it's extraordinary because it's so convincing, at least initially, that people aren't sure what's going on with it. So a guy from the New York Times, later famous as a conservative columnist, John Leo, starts writing about it. He and others contact the White House and say, well, is this real? And the White House, of course, say, well, we don't know. We have to check. And there's a 5-day process where inside the White House, run by Walt Rostow, the National Security Advisor, there is an investigation into whether this is real. And I've got the memos going all the way up to President Johnson. And they're quite concerned to work out what's going on with it, because obviously it could be horribly reputationally damaging. There's also an investigation in the atomic, in the disarmament agency, and there's also one in the Pentagon. And so there's a sort of serious attempt to try and work out if it's real. And eventually they decide that it must be a hoax. But at the same time, you have officials inside those big government departments in Washington sort of whispering to journalists that, well, some people in power actually do really think like this. And maybe, it's not as unreal as it's suggested. And you can see why this landed hard with particularly young men who were worried about being drafted and sent off to fight in Vietnam, and who may already have been suspecting, that the military industrial complex was more bothered about profit than their well-being. So you can see why it would take off. Right. And also the satirists don't sort of tell the story. They kind of keep it quiet and let it all unfold.
Yeah. They want to kind of keep that idea alive that it is in fact legitimate. And I would just sort of interject a little bit of opinion that they probably had good reason, those young men, to think that the military industrial complex was part of it. And just stay with me for 1 second here, Phil. At 33 minutes past the hour, you're listening to The Other Side of Midnight. I'm James Flippin. Phil Tinline, our guest here. And, Phil, the book is The Ghosts of Iron Mountain. And it's interesting to note that as much as you're saying, this is kind of established that it's a hoax and that report, the report from Iron Mountain was satire, there are some people who I think still to this day believe or contend that it was real, right? That it was like a legitimate thing. And that the hoax argument was kind of a cover-up for this having been leaked or put out there somehow. How much investigating did you do into that aspect of the whole thing?
Well, that's exactly right. And I mean, this starts quite a long time after the report comes out, but even longer back from now. So Lewin tries to get the report republished in the 1980s. But by this point, the idea that, and in the 70s, the idea that America has, money to burn on war is maybe feels like a good problem to have. It feels like a kind of relic from another age. And then he hears in 1990, by which time he's quite an old man, he hears to his enormous surprise that it has been republished. It's been republished by fascists who think it's real. And these are people who, some of the people concerned were actively involved in promoting the denial of the Holocaust. And they think it is a genuine government document, and that therefore, because that's in the public domain, they can just republish it. So they do republish it. And they suggest that it is the new protocol, so associating it with the infamous anti-Semitic smear hoax, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. But it's being proselytized by someone who's not actually a fascist. He's talking to the fascists, but he's he's a veteran. He's a guy who served in the Pentagon, a guy called Al Fletcher Pruitt. And he is the person who gives them his copy of the report so they can literally photocopy it and rebound it and sell it. He is the guy, I don't know if you remember the Oliver Stone movie JFK, but he is the basis of the Donald Sutherland character, the supposed sort of deep throat Mr. X guy who tells the secrets of the military industrial complex in the middle of JFK. That's based on this guy. It then spreads to the militia movement. They talk about it a lot after the Oklahoma City bombing. I'm not saying the report's responsible for that, but they talk about it afterwards a lot. And there's then a second hoax created off the back of it, a kind of operations manual for the elite on how to manipulate the sheeple. And that has influenced, it's called Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars. That's influenced Alex Jones. It's influenced QAnon. And you can see the report being mentioned by the guy who used to be the ideologue of the Oath Keepers as well. And you can still see it around online. There are videos made in the 90s called things like Iron Mountain, Blueprint for Tyranny, and those still circulate online as well. So no, if you want to believe that the state is absolutely evil and plotting against you, this looks like really good evidence. It's a hoax.
This episode is brought to you by Loom by Atlassian. Are you feeling stuck at work? Get your team unstuck with Loom video messaging and move work forward. Use Loom to simultaneously record both your screen and yourself to share a quick update, provide feedback, train a colleague, and everything in between. Plus, add Loom AI to your meetings for instant written notes and recordings. Try Loom today at Loom.com. That's LOOM.com.
This episode is brought to you by GM Genuine Parts and AC Delco. Get the most out of your vehicle with GM Genuine Parts and AC Delco original equipment. The only parts designed, engineered, tested, and backed by General Motors. You can find your perfect fit for most makes and models and choose from 3 tiers of parts, including GM OE or gold and silver aftermarket parts. Visit gmparts.com for more information.
PMS, pregnancy, menopause. Being a woman is a lot. Ollie supports you and yours with expert solutions for every age and life stage. They just launched 2 new products exclusively at Walmart. Period Hero combats bloat, mood swings, and more during PMS. And Balance Perimeno to support hormonal balance, mood, and metabolism during perimenopause. Grab yours at ollie.com. Ollie! These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.
Jif peanut butter. It's that Jiffing good, it doesn't really need advertising. So instead, enjoy the calming sounds of the ocean. Jif. Ooh, it's that Jiffing good. Get your Jif at Jif.com.
Yeah, well, in essence, that's a interesting transition to my next question, because Phil Tinline is our guest here, and we're talking about his new book called The Ghosts of Iron Mountain. And I guess maybe the treatise of the book, Phil, or kind of the part that's in between the lines, or something that you were actually just kind of alluding to in your most recent comments, is that the hoax and how it was received, the document, everything that it was saying, the lessons contained therein, let's say, has reverberated through the decades. And you're noting the reprinting in the 90s. But how do you contend it impacts American life to this day, the whole thing? Well,
you have to be careful not to overread these things, right? When you see a conspiracy theory, it's difficult sometimes not to come up with a conspiracy theory in response and so on. So it's not like I'm saying this is responsible for everything or anything like that. But I do think it's kind of a cautionary tale about the temptation, and I'm not exempting myself from this, we all have it, the temptation to believe stories that appear to be real because they confirm what you already think. And what I think it points to, and this is not unique to America, but I think it has a particular American kind of color, is after the Second World War, America, which was once created as, the Republic of Yeoman Farmers, a Republic of Small Farmers, against the kind of evil Leviathan of George III and the British Empire, has become, for the best of reasons, to defeat Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, but it's become the most powerful nation the world has ever seen. And it has this extraordinary kind of concentration of power around the atomic bomb. And time and again, with Fletcher Pruitt, with various people around the JFK story and so on, I think you can see, and some of the conspiracy theorists who are promoting this report, I think you can see a real serious concern, almost a trauma about what America had become after the war. The idea that you have this massive national security state, the idea you have something called the Central Intelligence Agency, which America had nothing like before, even during the First World War. The idea that you have this enormous concentration of power in faraway Washington and you don't know what it's doing. I think that concerns people both on the right and on the left, and not for no reason. But what happens, and I think what this report shows, is both the way that power concentrating, the people in power allow kind of stories to spread about it, which aren't very helpful. But there's a specific thing that happens, I think, which I think we all need to watch out for, wherever you are on the political spectrum. We saw this with the people in the centre here with Brexit. You have to be very careful to critique power in a way that's based on the evidence, but not just based on the kind of the monster images you have in the back of your mind. Because if you do that, then you tip into believing things that aren't true, which doesn't help anybody.
Interesting. So yeah, Phil Tinline is our guest, and his book, The Ghosts of Iron Mountain, is one that you might want to check out, because in essence it connects back to this purported deep state report from 1967, which was actually a piece of satire originally that was written and then published. And the thought is that this is kind of connected to some of the more conspiratorial bend among some Americans and the way they think about things. But I guess it is interesting, Phil, to think about it. And I'll put it back to you this way. I'm somebody who maybe doesn't necessarily believe in every conspiracy theory, but there's some of them that carry a decent amount of water with me. And I'll think back to something super recent, like the Las Vegas shooting, and just say, well, we never really got an explanation on that one. And, you think about some of the connections to Saudi Arabia and whatever did or didn't happen that night. I don't know. Pretty weird. And then you think about the JFK assassination and some of the ways that Oswald pretty clearly was a CIA asset in some way, shape, and form. And I think to myself, that's pretty weird. Seems as though elements of the so-called deep state back in before this time even were involved in things pretty crazy and pretty questionable, and things that connect to aspects of why people question the deep state and stuff like that. So is your point just more to say, let's take each piece of evidence as it comes and not necessarily dismiss the relative curiosity, but just kind of make sure that we're trying to be as fact-based as we possibly can be?
Yes, and I would also suggest being careful with this seems strange and I'm just asking questions. Those are perfectly sensible instincts, of course, vital journalistic instincts, a basis of journalism in a way. But what follows next, is, okay, I've got questions, but what are the actual answers to those questions? If even if something seems strange, maybe it has a kind of, the world's a complicated place. Maybe it just has an ordinary explanation. So I'm not personally convinced that Oswald was a CIA asset. I mean, the way I look at the JFK assassination is to put it the other way around. Let's say if the CIA decided, I don't think they did, but because in fact you can see papers inside the CIA at this time discussing whether the withdrawal from Vietnam would be a good idea. So shooting the president to stop him withdrawing from Vietnam would seem a weird way to proceed from there. But let's say that the CIA did want to assassinate the president. If you were going to do it, if you're in charge of it, is this the guy that you would pick to help you, who is clearly pretty scatty and violent and unstable?
You're talking about Oswald?
Yeah.
Well, I
I
think that in essence they probably had like 7 or 8 different plans, and a bunch of them all centered on the ability to frame this guy who was supposedly some crank guy who was all connected to the Soviet Union and loved communism so much he would do anything to take out JFK, and it really had no purported connection to Vietnam or the conflict in Asia that was developing and all the contained communism thing. It was more just like this guy loves it so much that he wants to stop Kennedy, who's anti-communism. So I think it was more of a cover-up type build-in, and obviously the shots came from the grassy knoll, so it doesn't even really matter whatever he was doing up in the book depository. There's a lot of documentation, even the stuff that just got dumped off the last month or so, showing that the CIA director, whatever his name was, now I can't remember his name, the guy who died in the 80s, basically had all these documents on his desk connecting to Oswald days before the assassination. So, I mean, it doesn't none of it washes. And he came back, he defected to the Soviet Union, and then he comes back, no problem. He obviously had help from people within the government to be able to do that.
Well, there's quite a lot of assertions there, which we're not going to have time to get into. I mean, as I say, put it the other way around. Why would you do it this way? Why would you shoot him in the street? Kennedy had nearly died several times, right? He was a very unwell man. Now, that wasn't public knowledge, but it was knowledge in the circles that kind of mattered. I mean, if I was the CIA and I was trying to assassinate him, I would try some of the things they tried with Castro, confect a heart attack. Why do it in such an enormously risky way? It doesn't really make any sense to me. It feels to me like taking an event that people sort of think always must have happened because it's so shocking, it kind of sears itself onto the mind immediately, and then you try and explain it afterwards. But the job of a historian is to go back a step and say, well, hang on, why did it happen in that way? Why did it just not happen? I mean, I think it's, in a way, the strangest coincidence, because I think it was straightforwardly Oswald and that's it, is how come a guy who was prepared to assassinate the president just happened to be working in the book depository when Kennedy drives past. But that would be based on the idea that the only angry 24-year-old young American man who knew how to fire a gun was that guy. I suspect, if looking at American history from that period, there were plenty of people who were pretty angry and knew how to use a gun. So I don't know. I step back from some of the kind of like, it must have happened like this. Why did it happen? And ask, why would you have done it like that in the first place? That doesn't make any sense to me at all.
Yeah. Well, look, I think it's a fascinating debate, one that certainly isn't going to be solved in this particular conversation. Phil Tinline is our guest, and his most recent book, The Ghosts of Iron Mountain, basically has some arguments within that say this hoax back in the 60s is connecting to some of the ways we look at the news cycle and maybe the so-called deep state, the military-industrial complex. And it is fascinating to think about that, because obviously history is kind of always written by the victors, and it's sort of always changing. You put a perspective on it, and you feel like it's different depending on your angle. So I definitely think it's worth keeping that in mind. But Phil, I want to give you kind of the final word in terms of how you think the significance and relevance of the report from Iron Mountain and your book covering it, The Ghosts of Iron Mountain, is still so relevant to everything we're talking about today.
Well, as I say, I think it's really important to keep an eye on the line between fact and fiction. I mean, one of the ways I think about this book is that it's a great story about the perils of great stories. And like I say, we're all subject to this. This is not people on the political extremes only. We just have to be very careful when we spot a story that seems to confirm everything we think, to just step back and say, hang on, if I didn't have these beliefs, would I still believe that story? I think if we all did that a little bit more, things might calm down a tiny bit.
Phil Tinline, The Ghosts of Iron Mountain. Check out his book. Phil, thank you so much for joining us here on The Other Side of Midnight. Hopefully we can have you on again to discuss your ongoing work.
I'd love that. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. Take care, and good to talk to him. So when we come back, we'll have a chance to talk to you guys. 1-800-848-9222. If you have a comment, if you have a thought on the interview, if you want to talk about the Ghosts of Iron Mountain, if you want to talk about the deep state and the military-industrial complex, we got you here on The Other Side of Midnight. I'm James Flippin. Flip out.
The Other Side of Midnight. Thanks for listening to The Other Side of Midnight. If you like the podcast, share it with your friends and listen anytime at WABCRadio.com and download the WABC Radio app. Hit that subscribe button on all major podcast platforms. Plus, follow WABC on social on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and X. See you next time for a new episode, so you never have to wonder,
what the heck is going on here?